Roster frenzy. The Fantasy Ruckers are back, and teams are keeping us busy with the frenzy of signings and trades happening over the past several weeks as we inch closer to the 2024 season. What does this mean for each respective squad? And more importantly, how does this impact Fantasy MLR? We, of course, also talk about the latest in the Rugby World Cup and other fantasy rugby competitions happening around the world. The Fantasy Rucker Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 82 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much for Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And boy, does it feel good to be back. It's been a little bit here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Had a little bit of an off-season break, had some scheduling stuff to deal with and to work out here. But we're back. And Matt, does it feel good to be here on the show with you once again? I missed you, man.
Yeah, I miss you too. I mean, it has just been a busy month of rugby, Ryan. And not just the fact that there's a Rugby World Cup going on in France and that nothing but excitement has been coming out of there. But also the MLR is deciding, hey, don't forget about us. You know, we got tons of news and we keep seeing the tweets coming in from all, the reliable sources. Brian Ray, DJ Coyle or Doug Coyle, MLR stats, jam delay, all of these things coming in. And we were just on a break, Ryan, and we just couldn't wait to come back and talk about it. So much so that we can't even get back to our awful rankings.
Yeah, no, we got too much to break down here in this episode with all the news and notes and roster moves that we got to catch up on. I mean, we thought last episode that we were on the show back less than a month ago on episode
which we also
81.
Couldn't get to our rankings because there was so much news going on.
We thought that was a whole bunch of news, and we thought that was a whole bunch of trades and roster moves going on that we needed to dedicate an episode. But hey, lo and behold, we got another one of those episodes here. So much to catch up on again. Had to figure out some scheduling changes here on the Fantasy Rucker Show. Had some work-related stuff that had to get sorted out, but we're back, and we're all about the Fantasy Ruckers here, so we're hoping to continue here on the weekly basis here as much as we possibly can and continue those top fantasy player rankings as we continue to go on. We got the center rankings coming up, so that will be interesting next episode, but again, got a whole bunch to touch on here in this episode when it comes to movement around Major League Rugby.
Yeah, we're back. The Fantasy Ruckers never gonna leave, and you know what else is also never gonna leave apparently is this ridiculous mustache that I have. So that is also back, so good luck dealing with that for an hour every week.
And I'm sad that Vandy isn't here too, because he's your inspiration when it comes to that.
I think that I kind of ployed him not being here because his mustache puts mine to shame. So I may or may not have conspiracied him out of the show this week.
We'll see. Well, we're gonna hope that Vandy can return soon again with the scheduling change. We're just trying to work everything out here on the back end here on the Fantasy Ruckers. But again, we are doing our best to make sure we're giving you all the latest fantasy Major League Rugby content on a weekly basis. And we are back here with episode 82, and we'll continue to do that moving forward. But yeah, before we get into it, like we say every episode, hey, if you aren't already, make sure you give us a follow at the Fantasy Ruckers for all the latest fantasy MLR content, Instagram. At X, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube as well. You want to follow us there with all the latest stuff. And if that's not enough for you, head to our Discord community. Got a nice community there that talks all things fantasy rugby, and with everything going on in the world of rugby right now, can chat all about that stuff there and have some in-depth discussion with some other passionate rugby fans. And we also have a website, thefantasyruckers.com, for all the latest when it comes to fantasy MLR. Got all of last season stats there, rankings, game by game breakdowns, pretty interesting stuff. And hey, there might be some things coming down the line when it comes to that website, so you want to stay in tune for that. But hey, Matt, let's get into it because we got no time to waste here. Obviously, we've got all those news and notes to catch up, but you mentioned at the top of the show, one of the best times for rugby right now. Got Rugby World Cup going on in France. You're donning the New Zealand All Blacks jersey. I thought, I don't think I've worn maybe once I've worn a jersey on this show, but here I had taken a little bit of inspiration from you, just like you took the inspiration of your mustache from Vandy, and
Yep.
I've decided to pay my respects to Ireland and
Well,
their unfortunate result over the weekend when it comes to falling to your New Zealand All Blacks in what was a very exciting quarterfinal matchup. But such a bummer that had to happen so early in the quarterfinals. That was a final-esque type matchup.
well, Ryan, I'm getting a feeling of a trend here with you. You know, the other national apparel that you wear is a Welsh jersey, and they also
That's
happen to
true.
lose this weekend as well. So I'm just thinking that maybe you're just enjoying losing and supporting the losing teams, but that's okay. That's okay because it was a great game. Both games were great, but yeah, that Ireland New Zealand, it's crazy that was a quarterfinal. It felt like a final.
Yeah.
It's sad to see the legend Johnny Sexton kind of end off on the note, not being able to break the Irish curse of not making it past the quarterfinal. But I hate to say it, I saw it coming. But both teams played an unreal game. New Zealand just ended out on top. But that felt like a grand final to me. And then also, I mean, alluding to the another one is like France, South Africa. That also
Yeah.
felt like a final to me. And it was just crazy that they're meeting in the quarterfinals and those games. I mean, you're expecting it to only go
Yeah.
up from here.
Yeah, I mean, it went down to the wire in both of those matchups. The Fiji matchup against
Yeah.
England ended up being a lot more exciting than I anticipated it to
Yeah.
be. Argentina handling Wales, and that one on Saturday as well. And it's setting ourselves up for a pretty nice semifinal, which should be an
Yeah.
exciting final in 2 weeks' time.
And I don't want to go into the weeds too much on this, just because we're talking fantasy Ruckers, we're talking MLR, but I just got to get something off my chest that we were ending the pool matches. There's a lot of talk on Reddit and some social media sites about Northern Hemisphere rugby. Has Northern Hemisphere rugby beaten Southern Hemisphere rugby? And what's happening to Southern Hemisphere rugby? Northern Hemisphere rugby has taken the top, and look where we are.
Yeah.
Three
Yeah.
Southern Hemisphere teams in the semifinals, one Northern Hemisphere team, and frankly, nobody wanted to see that Northern Hemisphere team make it through because everybody loves Fiji. So
Right.
it could have been another year of 4 Southern Hemisphere finals, but
True.
I don't know what it is. This Northern Hemisphere teams, they just seem to love choking in the big moments.
Well, I guess alluding to that, then to kind of predict your final here, if you had to do a quick prediction for next week's semifinal matchup, who you got here?
Well, New Zealand's going to beat Argentina.
Mhm.
I think
Convincingly?
I think it'll be a tight game. Argentina is a classed side, and
Mhm.
they're familiar with New Zealand, and they're familiar. They've also beaten New Zealand this year or in the past year as well.
Yep.
And I'm going to say South Africa over England, and it's going to be another repeat of
Do the math.
2015, I think, in England. South Africa versus, I don't think I'm getting this right. 2019, I don't know. Whenever they played in the final, it's going to be another repeat of South Africa and the All
Yeah.
Blacks. So
And it's always a good one to see those two countries duke it out, because I mean they're always
yeah,
you know really good stage performances.
see it
on
all
the
year
stage.
long
Really
though. We
exciting
see
one.
it every
It's
year.
true. Now
Every year.
It's true. But now shifting on kind of to something that I mentioned. It had this. I'm gonna go with this, and it's gonna have Major League Rugby ties. Don't worry. I want to get your opinion, Matt, on what you feel and your opinion is on names on the backs of the jersey. I know we've had this conversation before here on the podcast when it came to
Yeah.
putting out names on Major League Rugby jerseys, but I do notice a lot of teams putting their names on the backs of their jerseys in the Rugby World Cup. What's your thought on that? What's your opinion on having that?
I mean, I'm a traditionalist. I'm kind of always loved the old school way of just you don't like it's not about the player, it's just about the number, the position, the team. But I think in terms of marketing, when you think of business, that's the only way that you can actually market players in order to actually grow the game. They can say, "Oh, I don't like number 12. I've got to look it up." No, it's I like, I like the Bundyakis, or I like the Owen Farrells, or I like the
Right.
Marcus Smiths, or I like the Bowden Barretts or Richie Mowangas. I mean, the All Blacks don't have it. I'm pretty sure England is one of the few teams that actually does have last names on it. So that's why I was saying so many of their players. But yeah, I mean, I don't mind it. I think it's great for the big teams. I think when you bring it back to the MLR though, they can hardly afford jerseys that fit, let alone putting last names on jerseys. So
Fair enough.
so I'm
fair
not sure
enough.
why they're spending their money on that when they can at least, maybe spend it on players, talent, something else. But yeah.
Well, the reason why I bring that up is there was an interesting tweet put out, and it's not, it doesn't have to do with names on the backs of jerseys, but it
Yeah.
has to do with something that's even more against the tide when it comes to
I
being
don't
a
know about this.
traditionalist. And Marcel Brackey came out on X saying, "Hey, at USMLR, when are we getting confirmation that players are allowed to choose their playing
Jeez.
numbers for the upcoming season? Hearing we're close to a green light on this, so amped." And again, you
Jeez.
as a traditionalist, I think I know what the answer to that answer to your opinion of this is. For me, I think I'm probably in the same boat as you, because I think rugby is so embedded with having
Yeah.
that 1 to 15, 1 to 23. I mean, it's embedded in the game itself. I mean, what do
Can
you
I,
call the 8-man? It's
yeah.
the 8-man for the number 8. James Dealey had an interesting tweet in response to Marcel Brackey saying, "Hey, if you're gonna have your own numbers, what the heck do we do with the number 8 position? Because
Well,
it's no longer the number 8."
see, this is where I think the argument goes against the argument for names on the back of jerseys, right? Like we look at what the names on the back of the jersey, what that doesn't do is impact the kind of the fundamentals of the game.
Sure.
It's a number, yes, it doesn't really matter. But when I'm explaining somebody new to the sport of,
Hmm.
hey, that guy's wearing number 8, everybody who wears number 8 plays this position. So you
Right.
know when you see number 8, this is the type of player he is. This is what he does. This is what his role on the field should be. When I see number 9, I can say this is exactly what he does on the field. This is
Right.
exactly where he goes. And only for the last, 40 minutes will you start to see the subs come on, and then you got to maybe ask some questions. But even then, there's still method to the way that the numbers are done,
Right.
which is why I'm kind of one of the people that are so get so worked up when they don't get the bench numbers right, because those are crucial in terms of helping somebody new understand the game. You tell them the number 2 does this, the number 1 and 3, these are their roles, the 6 and 7, these are their roles, 11, 14, 15, you can expect them to be faster guys in the back, playmakers, guys who score the tries. That is something that is crucial to growing the game. That is something crucial to teaching the game, and it makes it easier. It's one thing that I don't think you can take away, because the newer fans will need that to understand who is who and what is what, and what they're watching and what the players are doing, and be able to easily identify, okay, I'm that guy. I wear number 15. He's wearing number 15. That's the type of
Yep.
player that I should be watching. So
Yeah.
I think this kind of goes against that. So I'm big against this. Names on the back, okay, it seems like more of a money issue to me. Jersey numbers on the back, still a money issue, because still can't afford it. But also I think it goes against kind of growing the game with new fans.
Yeah. Well, no. Now each player is responsible for their
Yeah.
own jersey. They
And
got to do their own laundry with it.
well,
They just give them a few copies at the start of the season, a few pairs of jerseys there, and then they're good to go. They are now in charge of it. But no, I agree with you. I mean, that's the point that I would have brought up in all seriousness. That I think it goes against growing the game, and especially when you have the Rugby World Cup coming up in about a decade's time, and you want to really help people understand the sport once
yeah,
2033 rolls around. I think that is obviously a big
31.
a big thing for that. So it should be interesting though.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And
it's a
you know
thought
what?
that can out there.
Our friends, Alistair Kirschpool and Rugby Morning on their glorious
Rugby
morning,
podcast.
glorious rugby podcast. They reached out. They actually tagged Marcel Brocky and said, "Hey, I think we got to get you on the show and talk about this." And he seemed very open. So Ryan, I don't know. Maybe he's got to get on here, explain himself. I'm gonna, disagree with one of the kind of U.S. legends of the MLR, and we'll have to see where it goes from there. Maybe.
All right. Well, quickly before we get into all the signings that we need to get into, last thing I want to do, as leaders of the fantasy MLR space, man, I think we'd call ourselves out, right? I think we got the
Well,
the self pro the self
leaders of the
fantasy MLR
MLR.
space.
Yes, fantasy MLR.
Fantasy
Yes.
MLR space. I think that's a self-proclaimed title that we can give ourselves and throw on the
Yes,
resume.
unofficial.
We like to dabble into other fantasies and see how it kind of plays out. And again, this is a conversation we've had before about the historical kind of implementation of fantasy rugby in other leagues around the world. And of course, with the Premiership kicking off this past weekend, we got invited by some league members of ours to dabble a little bit in the fantasy Premiership space on superbrew.com.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that league operates is the classic salary cap base. So I
Yeah.
quickly wanted to touch on this because obviously here at Fantasy MLR we wanted to integrate and kind of combine the worlds of our traditional North American fantasy sports with our love for rugby, and wanted to go the draft route instead of the salary cap team building route. And as you and I were at this time co-managing and building a roster and team
Hmm.
together, as we were building that, what was kind of going through your head in terms of the pros and cons, or just your overall thoughts quickly about kind of that way of playing fantasy rugby a week into the fantasy premiership season versus the way that we do it here on the Fantasy Ruckers?
Well, first of all, I'll put out a disclaimer that look, I've lost touch with the Premiership. I have to say it. I admit it. But now that they're back on, now that not they're back, but now that they're on Rugby Network, now that I don't know, I think they're saying like a free month before you have to start paying for Rugby Network Premium or whatever it's called. I'll take that month and I'm gonna watch some Premiership rugby. But in terms of the experience, right? I mean, it's been a while since I've done one of those fantasy rugby leagues where it's the salary cap. I forgot about the salary cap for a little bit. I was like, what are these numbers that are in millions beside these players? And then I remembered that I actually have to watch about the type of players that I'm picking and the value of the players that I'm picking. So it just felt a little bit different. It felt like I had to really make sure that I was spending the salary cap wisely. And yeah, it was
I mean,
a
but
lot
as it
different.
as it
Yeah.
as it pertains to kind of your comparison with the approach of like the draft base, like what in terms of after you had your team, you went through a weekend, like
Yeah.
what kind of is
Well,
your
it was a lot. It's different because my picks are not affected by what other people pick.
right,
Right?
right,
The way that the Fantasy Ruckers League works, the way that we're trying to like incorporate the North American style league that works is like somebody else's pick directly impacts the quality of your side because they could take a player that you think you're going to have. In the way
yeah,
that this is, like, I didn't even have to worry. It's just a game within myself and a
yeah.
game within us to be, all right, do we want this guy for the value that he has? Yes. All right, great. Let's pick him up. And it never really kind of factored in competitive element to it. Yes, there's a
Sure.
competitive of scoring high points, but in terms of the selection of players, I'm not competing against somebody else to hope that I value him correctly before somebody else gets him, right? So
And
that was kind of the big thing that I felt was missing for sure.
and I think for me, kind of to that same point, it's just with the draft aspect of it, you feel like you own your team.
Yeah.
You feel like it's your team. No one else can have that same lineup, at least within your league. And
Yeah.
it feels like, obviously then it lends itself to having trades and picking up guys and different things like that. Of course, you can kind of swap your lineup with a salary cap, but it's a completely different game.
Yeah.
And it's exciting though. It's exciting that there's different options here. And it's just exciting that this is such a new and novel idea, at least the way that we're approaching it. That it should be interesting to see how that kind of grows and how that compares to kind of how fantasy has historically been done in the world of
And
rugby. But hey, you,
yeah.
you didn't do too bad. You might not have had been much experience in it, but hey, top 50% in the world, ranked 7,468 out of 17,000 people playing it.
Not too
That's
bad
pretty
for
good.
us,
That's
Ryan.
not
Not
too
too
bad.
bad. I mean, we took Henry Slade. He put the team on the back and he just carried us to that top 50%. But hey, Ryan, one last jab in here before we move on to the important MLR roster moves. We are supporters of all fantasy rugby. We love our fantasy MLR. We love the Super Brew. We obviously prefer our fantasy MLR. The best thing about both of these is I don't have to buy stupid NFTs to be able to put a team up.
Well,
All
we
right,
know
that
how
was
much
it.
we know how much that flopped, and I think that's enough to be said there. Again, you can check out our tweet history or our X history with regards to that about how there was a fantastic failure article that came out with regards to
You can
fantasy
give me
rugby.
a.
But hey,
I
we're
don't.
right here, right here.
Super Brew gives me a salary cap that I would never have in real life. With the
Well,
NFTs, I have a real salary cap that I have to think about, and that's my bank account, and I don't like that.
No. This is supposed to be fantasy world. This is supposed to be
That's
something
too
that has an
real.
impact
That's
here.
too real, people.
Too real, exactly. All right, well let's shift on to it. Like we said, got a lot of signings to get to
Holy cow,
here when it
Ryan.
comes around Major League Rugby, and
Holy cow.
because there's so much to catch on, we're gonna do this a little bit differently than what we've done in weeks before. We're gonna go through all the signings first. And we're gonna go by team when it
Whoa.
comes to that, break it down from a fantasy perspective, and then get into some of these trades that happened, and then talk about some other news and notes around the league. But I think I want to get into these signings as quickly as possible because there's just so many to get to here. So I mean, let's start off with a team that really just said, hey, we're going to bring back a whole bunch of guys that we had last year
Yeah.
and roll with it because the Toronto Arrows, the newly branded Toronto Arrows, bring back 9 different guys that they had on the team last season. I'm
Yeah.
going to list them out for you here, and then we can go through the guys that are kind of fantasy relevant. Mitch Richardson is returning. Jack McRogers, friend of the show. It's good to see. He's sticking as a Toronto Arrow.
Yeah.
Tyler Rowland, Cole Brown, Kieran Breen, Liam Bowman, Connor Grindall, Travis Larson, and Deshaun Bowen are all returning for the 2024 season as Toronto Arrows in their newly branded uniforms. Some guys in that list a little bit more fantasy relevant than others.
Yeah.
But it looks like Toronto, before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of it, Matt, it looks like Toronto is just kicking it back with some of the same guys and hoping that maybe some tactical changes, some better luck when it comes to injuries is going to see them a little bit more success here in 2024.
Yeah. I mean, hashtag rise up, right? Um, But yeah, I think for me, like I know that they added guys. I mean, they got Robbie Povey, they got Rewida Biddle, they lose Mitch Eady, they keep Sam Malcolm. But like when I look at this, I'm just surprised that they're continuing to go on this same route of getting these young Canadian players. And I understand that it's important for Canadian development and they play a role in the Canadian team development. But at some point, you got to look at yourself as a franchise, right? As a professional franchise that needs to have success. And you're seeing and we're going to get into it, what all the other teams are doing. But where are the international signings, right? Like, where are the quality players that are coming from overseas that we have found out that you need in order to be successful in the MLR? And I am I appreciate that they're staying on that route
Right.
to help with Canadian rugby and help with the development of these young guys, but I just think that they're missing. They're not balancing it correctly. Like there's too much of we see too much of the of these young Canadian guys filling in roster spots rather than these being filled in by some international players. And I think for me, it's just a shame that we're probably with these signings and the number of signings that are kind of the same team as last year. We're probably going to expect similar results from the Toronto Arrows as well.
I mean, we'll see. Again, there hasn't been those shortage of moves that they have made to try to spice things up and make it different. You mentioned Robbie Povey. You mentioned Tarangatira Waitokia, or excuse me, Rewida Biddle.
Both of them, yeah.
Both of them on there. That should add a little bit of flair to the mix. But yeah, I mean, it's a noble cause, like I said, but I feel like kind of the same opinion here. They're always going to be on the back foot. I mean, if they're able to get it done and be successful with that kind of really big emphasis, which I don't foresee changing anytime soon, it would be really cool to see. I mean, as you and I who have grown up in the Canadian rugby system and have grown up and gone through, some of the ranks through that, it would be really, really cool to see. But yeah, it's going to be always tough when you see the success, like you mentioned, Matt, of these other teams and how they went about being successful in the MLR. But hey, let's talk about some of these guys individually though, because there are still some guys, at least from a fantasy perspective, that are relevant, and to see them return to the Arrows, if hopefully it's an improved Arrows team, their output should improve. We'll start off by Mitch Richardson, playing most of his games at the center position. Fantasy relevant. I mean, 126.2 fantasy points on the season. Had a high of 27.4 in round 10. Averaging around your high singular digits to kind of mid-range double-digit type scorings. Mitch Richardson is a guy that a lower end center player that you could target if he's going to see that same playing time. That would be solid here for the Toronto Arrows, and especially in the world of fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, definitely has been fantasy relevant for sure. But we look at these lineups: Tarangatira, Waitokia, Rewida Biddle. How does that impact him? But still, I think this is a great signing. This is one of those domestic signings of a guy who's obviously had a lot of impact for them and a lot of positive impact for the Arrows.
Yeah, and then you go down the list. Front row players in there, again, not as fantasy impactful when it comes to the world of fantasy MLR, but still guys that have been fantasy relevant in the past. Jack McRogers, we've seen what he's done in the past. Matt, I believe you drafted him, in this past season. Didn't last long on your fantasy roster, just seeing how Toronto shaked out. But again, he's someone that's been there. Kieran Breen, Liam Bowman has been relevant. I think the name that's probably going to resonate the most outside of Mitch Richardson is going to be Deshaun Bowen. We saw what he was able to do towards the end of the season. He was was a highly sought out fantasy pickup there when he had that 3 try performance, 34.5 points in
Yeah,
round 8, 34.5 fantasy points on the season, 90.4. Kind of tapered off towards the tail end there.
called
After
it.
that, he had 2 other matches where he scored a try, 13.3 points, 12.4. But yeah, Deshaun Bowen, there's a lot of potential there. He was able to do big things when he was given the opportunity at times. We'll see whether or not he can make a bigger name for himself in fantasy. But that's the other guy that, at least from the waiver wire perspective, midway through the season, was a guy that people were definitely aware of.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if, seeing the way that he tapered off, if he'll still be that type of fantasy relevant. I think we saw some holes in the game that kind of impacted the way that his impact in fantasy rugby outside of that hat trick or 4 try game that he had. But yeah, I mean, kind of same guys like we talked about, same guys as last year. Not really too much exciting stuff here, like the signings of other teams that they made.
Yeah, so let's shift on some of those other teams. Old Glory DC making some interesting signings. Corey Daniel is returning to Old Glory DC. The big one here is probably Jamison Fa'anana Schultz, the captain. He's returning to OGDC. Good to see that.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy that's been very fantasy relevant in the 2023 season. He's a guy that picked up 158.4 fantasy points, started in 13 of the 13 matches he played in, was consistent, was your tackle machine guy. I think outside of 3 matches that he played in, double-digit tackles, really hovered around that double-digit mark. Only 2 times this season was he below that 7.9 point mark. So he's a guy that you can rely on each week and out. And knowing that he's the captain, knowing that he's returning, he's a guy that's probably going to be targeted here as a consistent performer. Maybe not with that fantasy upside. The highest that he scored this past year was 21 points, which is solid. But again, those matches were far and few in between there. He was just a guy that was consistently getting you double digit with that tackle baseline from the captain of Old Glory DC.
Yeah, I mean, he's a staple. He's a guy that we kind of talked about every week. So it's good to see him back. It's also great to see Corey Daniel back. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I know we didn't get to see much of him last year, but we really are hoping to see more of him. And he was a guy that was definitely highly ranked going into last year's season. And we're hoping to
Yep.
see the same this year as well. And they've got a couple international signings here, that I'm pretty excited about. I think the Scottish winger Damien Hoyland for me is the one that I'm probably the most excited about. Anytime you see a guy coming from overseas, he has a sevens background as well, with Scotland, which is, great for the winger. We've seen how sevens guys do in the MLR. Kurt Baker, a lot of guys from the Canada Sevens team. We've seen how they've done Brock Webster. It'll be really interesting to see him come in and really inject himself into this Old Glory DC side.
Yeah, 9 years of experience, over 100 caps with Edinburgh Rugby.
Yeah.
He represented the Barbarians. That jersey behind us here, that comes from. Yeah, a lot of experience there, and it's looking like the Scottish ties with Old Glory DC is playing. Is definitely having its impact here for the Old Glory DC side,
Yep.
which is always good to see. Those international connections and bringing that high level talent over is always good. Last international signing for Old Glory DC, Argentinian winger Axel Mueller is joining Old Glory DC. That should be interesting to see as well.
Yeah,
And
I
the
don't
one
know
that I
too
want to
much about him, but I mean, again, you're excited to kind of see them play in the MLR for sure.
Yeah, and then the last guy I want to bring up is, I think, a staple of Old Glory DC, Mike DeBoulis. He's returning as well to Old Glory DC. Not a guy that was necessarily that fantasy relevant. He may have been
Yeah.
a streamer for you when he was starting, had more of an impact at the beginning of the season, rather towards the tail end. Again, only 43.9 fantasy points. I believe he was battling injury towards the end of the season, I want to say. I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, had the ability to kind of go up there, had a 12.9 point high performance. Probably not a guy that we're looking for in fantasy circles, but definitely a guy that will be on your waiver wire that will definitely be talked about in terms of pickups and streaming options as we get through the season. But yeah, Old Glory DC pretty active there. Another team that has been pretty active, and I appreciate the way that they did this. The San Diego Legion just going out with 2 tweets and basically just announcing everyone is basically coming back. They come out with a tweet, I believe, with 9 guys.
Yeah.
Isaac Ross, Tavita Taimalau, Mikey Teo, Alex Horan, Sean McNulty, Justice Henderson, and Tapua Ma'afu Afungia.
Nice.
All returning with the San Diego Legion. Obviously, we know what Mikey Teos does. We know what Josh Henderson was able to do in the fantasy circles. Tavita Taimala was a guy that was very fantasy relevant, especially from that front row position.
Yeah.
And even Isaac Ross, we've seen what he can do from that lock position as well. But again, very very key re-signings there for San Diego Legion that was very high powered last year.
I think,
We
yeah.
also have the announcement of Justice Sears Daru, Luke Green, Tian Lutz was a guy that was very fantasy relevant, and Nathan Sylvia as
I
well.
mean,
Yeah, San Diego coming out with everything. Kind of pulling
yeah.
a Toronto here.
Yeah, well, it looks much better than Toronto, I must say. But the big ones are actually the ones they didn't announce in this one, and they had their own special tweet for these guys. Obviously with the season last year, Thomas Arwaki, another 3 years for him. He's re-signing with them as well, and Christian Poitevin coming back for another 3 years. Both of those guys, I mean, some of the biggest fantasy relevant San Diego Legion players. When Christian Poitevin came back, he
Right.
was definitely someone loved to have in their lineup. The way that he was able to have that offensive impact as a flanker.
And you know that because he was sitting
Oh yeah.
on Hokie's bench to buy you a trip to
Oh
the
yeah.
final.
And the way that he was able to be a threat at the breakdown, and Thomas Owaki, obviously just his try scoring ability on that San Diego Legion offense was something else. But to me, the big thing to point out here, and I don't know how often we've seen this, Ryan, but 3 more years for both of them. 3 years. And you do not see those types of,
No,
even we don't even see that exposed to us half the time about
sure.
how long they're being signed for. But these two high caliber players saying, yeah, I believe in the MLR. I believe in the San Diego Legion. I'm gonna stay here for 3 years because that's how I want to give back to this club, and
Mhm.
that's how long I want to continue playing in the MLR. Uh, it's interesting to see, and I hope that this continues to be a trend where we know who's coming back, where we have a bit more visibility into understanding. Hey, this is a contract for 3 years. We know that he'll be back next year, and not having that kind of fantasy wise unsure and kind of lack of clarity of who's actually going to be on the squad until a week before the draft.
Yeah, no, for sure. And just kind of breaking down the fantasy relevance of some of these guys. I mean, Thomas Awake, again,
Oh yeah,
186.6 fantasy points. Rare to see him score anything less than around 12 points. He only had 3 matches this past season where he did that. I mean, this guy towards the tail end of the year, I mean, round 15, 20.5 points, round 16, 24.2, round
yeah.
17,
Holy
21 points. He
cow!
was pivotal in your fantasy MLR playoff run there. Talk about Mikey Teo. He's a guy that also been very fantasy relevant, 182.1 fantasy points. Has those up and down matches, but he has that ceiling where he can hit you that 27.2 fantasy points, which is pretty impressive. You talk about Poitevin up there as well, 108.1 fantasy points, but again, had the that injury early in the middle of the season, was solid for you for those first 8 weeks, double digit fantasy points on the regular, and then yeah, like you said, he was that big time factor in the fantasy playoffs, 20.6 fantasy points, 16.9 in that semifinal final fantasy MLR run for us. And yeah, I mean, again, it's just there's a lot of guys here on this list on a high powered San Diego Legion team that we now know are returning, and it looks like it's going to look very much the same as it did in 2023.
Yeah,
And you can have a lot of confidence when drafting these guys. And there's a lot of potential there too. Obviously, there was a lot of hopes with Sean McNulty coming in, but we saw what Sam Malolo was able to do to take over. Just there's a whole bunch of names here that there's a lot of juicy information to take out from for fantasy perspectives that you're just having, like you said, a lot of clarity for the San Diego Legion team heading into this fantasy season that you can be quite confident in terms of drafting these guys and knowing kind of what responsibilities they will have and the fantasy output that they're going to be able to give you in the next year.
yeah. I mean, it's looking pretty scary. The San Diego Legion side coming back pretty much unchanged. So,
Yeah.
um,
Because I mean, in the MLR, it's hard to see it because once you see some of these guys like really take over, right? You see these movements to overseas leagues, right? We
yep,
understand that Major League Rugby is a stepping stone for some of these guys to get to those bigger leagues. But San Diego, man, they have their core, they have their guys, and it looks like they're going to run it back here to try to get themselves that shield next year. I mean, they were really close. They were damn close last year. They just were not able to get it done. And they have a lot of confidence, obviously, that this group that they have will be able to do that. And that's going to look
yeah,
pretty dang good for the world of fantasy MLR. Let's shift on over to the Dallas Jackals now. A couple moves here for them. Damon Torres. is coming to the Dallas Jackals. Obviously, we've heard his name before, previously playing for the no longer Rugby Atlanta side that will be moving to Los Angeles.
Go teamies.
He signs with the Dallas Jackals. He's a guy that was somewhat relevant for fantasy
Yeah.
circles. I mean, he was again one of those guys that was a streamer that you maybe throw in there for your back row position. He had the ability and the potential. I mean, I think it was just tough sometimes with the back row with Rugby Atlanta to have confidence in him. But again, we'll see whether or not he earns maybe a little bit more playing time here with the Dallas Jackals. It's going to be tough with obviously the likes of having Sam Gala there, having the likes of some of these other guys. We do have some departures that happen with Dallas Jackals. So hey, maybe he can carve himself a role and make himself more fantasy relevant.
Yep.
But the guy that was even more fantasy relevant, especially from that front row position, was Juan Pablo Zeiss. I mean, he was pretty solid for you. Again, the point totals, they're not going to be as inflated as some of these higher scoring positions. But I mean, when you have a prop that was able to get you 19.4 points one week, 2 tries in round 13, and kind of hovering around that 5 to 6 point mark, he was relevant. I mean, he's your lower end front rower that you may plug in play on an off week when one of your main hookers that you rely on try scoring ability isn't there. Juan Pablo Zeiss was a guy that you could have turned to in 2023.
Yeah, yeah, he was definitely. I mean, in terms of Dallas Jackals players, he's definitely one of the few guys that we would actually be okay with picking up.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, not too many moves from the Dallas Jackals, but I think I think we'll see more from them for sure. And we've already seen a little bit of re-signings from the past, but just they're not part of this big surge of moves.
Absolutely. All right, shifting over to the Chicago Hounds, who made some moves themselves and
Yeah.
some big international moves. They signed U.S.-born Irish scrum half Nick McCarthy
Hmm.
from overseas, and then I think the bigger one here, obviously a marquee name in the world of rugby, Dave Kearney is coming to the Chicago Hounds. Marquee Irish player, marquee
Yeah.
Leinster rugby player. He's a guy that has been pretty pivotal in that. He's a guy that. If you may not know, has a is part of the ownership group with his brother with the
Jackie
Chicago
Moon.
Hounds team. So kind of coming in there, Jackie Moon coming in. We've seen the coach player role with Baker, Kurt
Owner player
Baker.
role.
Now we're seeing owner player role. That should be quite
I
interesting.
mean,
But
what
it's
happens?
cool.
How long until Rob Kearney comes back as well? And he starts playing for the Chicago Hounds as well. Both of them have that ownership stake. Rob and Dave might as well come playing. He might just be watching a training, put on the boots, and just have to. So, um, you know, this would be interesting to see. This is literally Jackie Moon. This is literally the Flint Tropics. So it'll be fun to kind of make a little bit of fun out of that one all year round. And by the way, Nick McCarthy, U.S. international. I know he played with some of the tests before the World Cup because obviously the U.S. didn't make it to the World Cup, just like Canada. I know he played in some of those tests, and I believe he also is coming from Leinster as well. So
Mhm.
a couple Leinster guys coming together. Just one of them happens to be the big boss man, the big owner.
Yeah, and then the other move that the Chicago Hounds made was Ben Landry
Yeah,
is signing with the Chicago Hounds.
we
He moved
like
on from
Ben Landry.
Seattle. Said that he was moving on from the Seawolves. Obviously, we obviously can speculate what that was about. That back row side on
Well,
Seattle was pretty filled up. He finished off 4 weeks in a row playing at that back row position for Seattle. Has that second row experience where he played most of last year, and he was fantasy relevant. I mean, 108.2 fantasy points, especially at that second row position when he has that eligibility. Peaked at around 11 points at that second row, which is pretty solid. Got 14.3 at the back row position. Ben Landry is a guy that could carve himself a role here on the Chicago Hounds, a Chicago Hounds team that is still trying to find their identity, that's still trying to improve. Landry might be a big part of that.
I mean, he was definitely on and off rosters last year. I know a big guy, kind of a guy you could rely on to make tackles, for sure. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see him kind of get that opportunity in a bit of a more clear cut starting position. And he'll definitely, I think, even this raises his value, in my opinion, and a guy that we're going to look for in the upcoming year. But
I mean,
yeah,
what's interesting with Landry is that he started every single match that
yeah,
he played in. So I'm not too sure what the kind of outlook with the Seawolves are with
yeah.
that. They know that, but hey, he's going to try to carve himself that same starting role here with the Chicago Hounds.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, with the whole statement that he was saying how he was moving on to different opportunities, I did not expect that he was just going to be moving on to another MLR team. I thought it was
Yeah.
going to be like going overseas. They made it seem like that. But hey, he wanted to go to the Windy City. It is what it is. He wanted to have an opportunity there. Maybe they're paying him more money. Who knows?
I mean, and I will say I'm excited for these moves, especially obviously the signing of Dave Kearney to see him come over. But I'm not gonna get fooled by the Chicago Hounds team again. You can mark it
Well,
down here until they prove me different. Well, obviously I'll put my money where my mouth is when we do next year's
we all
pre-rankings
know you're gonna
coming in.
rank Hanko Gramicious up there in the top five. Okay.
Hey, I love me some Hanko. What can I say? But yeah, we'll see there. But Chicago's got to do some convincing for me after they hurt me so bad when it comes to my fantasy
Yeah,
expertise heading into this year.
it's an
But all right,
understatement.
let's shift on over to Houston. They signed Ronan Murphy. He's a guy that sorry, just pulling up his profile here. Um, 3 MLR caps for Austin back in 2022.
Yeah.
Went over to the American Raptors in their inaugural season in Super Rugby Americas. Is coming back to the MLR. Should see or it'll be exciting to see kind of what he's able to do here from that back
Yeah.
row position. Again, not something that we need to talk much about. The bigger one here is the return of Gideon Van Vyk, who is coming back to the Houston SaberCats, who was someone that we know is very fantasy relevant here for Houston.
Yeah, and this is great signing for Houston or re-signing for Houston. I think it's really great for fantasy rugby, first of all, and even better for the Houston SaberCats that he's coming back. I think this is also a pretty good sign and kind of feels promising for the MLR that a quality talent like Gideon Van Vyk, a young player, by the way, a young South African, is seeing potentially having opportunities, probably getting opportunities and offers elsewhere, but choosing to stay in the MLR, which I think is a great sign for the MLR and a great sign for kind of North American professional rugby that there are international guys that are choosing to want to continue to stay within the league.
Yeah, and then two more signings here that we got to get off the plate from two different teams. Seattle, not too much a big one. It's a kind of wait and see approach, but Namibian utility back is going to the Seawolves.
Well, yeah.
Devon Rousseau
I
should be
mean,
interesting to
yeah, I
see.
mean, we talked about how the World Cup kind of plays for some of these tier two nations like Namibia, how it plays for almost like a scouting review. I mean, the MLR
Right.
players that are in there, they kind of get a scout in terms from the bigger teams and the bigger leagues. But these guys that don't have any professional contracts, he was a starter for the Namibian team in the World Cup. And Seattle obviously saw something that they liked, and they decided like, hey, we're going to reach out and try to get this guy on our squad.
Yeah, and then the big one here with NOLA,
Yes,
I don't think we need to touch about much. It kind of speaks for itself.
yes.
But JP Duplessis is returning to the NOLA Gold, re-signs with the New Orleans squad. This is a guy that was probably the most fantasy relevant on this list
Oh
that we had
yeah,
so far. 204.2 fantasy points on the season, finished fourth overall in all of fantasy MLR. This guy was a machine at times. I mean, a high of 25.7 points. What he was able to do between the weeks of round 6 and round 12, every single week, didn't score any lower than 14.5 except
yeah,
for one match in that span. Yeah, this guy was huge for you. He was part of your winning squad here
yeah.
for
He
your
sure
fantasy
was.
championship this past season.
Yeah, he's a beast, and it's great to see him back. Great to see him back with Nola. He's kind of like the face of the franchise at this point. So it's awesome to see. Not much else we can say. The guy's a stud. The guy's literally one of the best players in the MLR. Ryan, before we move on to some other things, Miami Sharks kind of making some low key moves.
Yeah.
Well, not moves, but they're randomly announcing things that they haven't officially announced. They're
Yeah.
talking about the Wales and Argentina, kind of the lead up to that quarterfinal match. Obviously, because they've announced that Thomas Gubelli, who's playing on the Argentina side, but then they also, in the same breath, almost make it official that two Welsh forwards, Rob Evans and Kirby Myhill, are also on the Miami Sharks squad. So it looks like they're bringing in some pretty notable international talent onto that team. I was going to say this, Ryan, just as we're talking about these signings in the Miami Sharks, is that I think the Miami Sharks are doing a little bit better than the Chicago Hounds did last year. I mean, they don't have the luxury of getting that big, old Gilchrist ruins two teams kind of expansion draft.
Yeah.
But the way that they're going about some of these international signings, the way that they're going about filling out this roster, it seems like it's going to be a quality side. Maybe this year, instead of you getting fooled by the Chicago Hounds, I'm going to be fooled by the Miami Sharks. So we'll see about that. But it seems like their team already is in a better state than what the Chicago Hounds were at the same time last year.
Yeah,
Well, I don't
should
even
be.
think Chicago Hounds existed at the same time last year.
Well, it should be interesting to see how that Shark squad does pan out. I got to say, you can't get fooled by a team that has as good team colors as they do. Still excited to see kind of how that
Uh,
all shakes out and plays out.
what are the
But all right,
Galtinis?
That's true. All right. Well, let's talk about we've at least talked about the signs. Let's get into some trades here because there were no shortage of trades here either. I don't think these were as big of a trades. I think definitely one in there
Yeah.
that is definitely a big one that we need to talk about, which we'll get to. Not as big trades as we saw in the prior episode when we were breaking them down. But I think the big thing here, and it's funny that we don't have Vandy on this episode, is because what we once thought, maybe you guys never did, but for what I thought was kind of becoming familiar with, okay, what is the value of some of these things in these
No,
trades?
this is
Yeah, completely turning it around because I have no
this.
idea how valuable
I don't.
cap considerations are because that is seems to be the hot
There's no
commodity
way.
at least for one team here in the MLR.
There's how much money does the guilty? What are these? They must be just racking. What they just have a pile sitting in the middle of nowhere because this is all they've been doing. I mean, I don't know if Rattle's doing these trades or is the LA team doing the trades. Who's doing the trades here? Who's racking up the money? It's a Rattle team trying to make as much money as they can before they actually officially leave the MLR. I don't know what's happening here, but there is no way that Johan Mumson and Justin Basson are just worth salary cap considerations.
Yes, yes. Well, let's
Yeah.
get into it then.
All right.
Let's talk about it. Okay, let's talk about
I don't I
what
don't
what
I don't
what this
understand.
future LA team is doing because they were the bulk of the trades that happened over the course of the six that went down. Three of them made by this future LA team. The first one, like Matthew mentioned, Johan Mumson and Justin Basson going to the Houston SaberCats for 2024 cap
What
considerations.
the heck?
Value's tough here. I have no idea. Again, Johan Mumson's a guy, at least from the fantasy circles, that you drafted really
He's
early.
yeah.
Was going to be that second row kind of pivotal player for you. 104.5 fantasy points on this season. Started 14 of the 15 matches he played in. Was a leader of that Rugby Atlanta squad. He goes on over to the Houston SaberCats, which is a mega addition for the
Yeah.
SaberCats. It's going to be great. And then you talk about Justin Basson, not as fantasy relevant, but still there, 72.4 fantasy points. It looks like that this Houston SaberCats team has just bolstered their second row quite a bit here for what cost them a little bit of cap consideration.
I don't even know what that means anymore. You know, if Vandy was on here, he'd be saying the same thing. He has no clue.
It is true.
He thinks
It is true.
Vandy thinks it's a deal through the Netherlands or something, like that, through Switzerland, through the banks and or cash under the table. So I have no clue what this means. I just know that Johan Mumson, Justin Basson are valuable players on the field. Johan Mumson definitely valuable in terms of fantasy wise, one of the top second rows that we went through in our rankings.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't understand, but yeah, good for Houston. Way to go. Really, everybody's kind of it's like Atlanta is this carcass on the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well, we'll
the
get into kind of the approach with this because I think for me, there's a certain philosophy that I think I might be getting an understanding of if I think it's operating in that way, which actually may not be necessarily a terrible thing. But we'll talk about that in just a second here. I just want to get into it. There's two other trades that they did just to kind of encompass the
yeah,
whole thing. They acquire, or at least they trade away Vili Hilu, who was fantasy relevant
who
in
was
2023 for 2024 cap considerations.
Ay, ay,
Vili
ay.
Hilu racked up 87.8 fantasy points this season, was kind of your middling, lower end tier back rower that you kind of slot in on a streaming type basis. And then Chase Shore Haskin, which is actually funny. Not really that fantasy relevant on our end, but I think what made it the most funny was the tweet that was brought up by James Dealey and MLR Stats was how Chase Shore Haskin has to be the most traded player in MLR history. The guy was drafted 6th overall by New York in 2021, traded from New York to NOLA, traded from NOLA to Rugby Atlanta, and now traded from Rugby Atlanta or now the LA team to Miami. This guy's been on the move. He's been on a backpacking trip just because of the MLR, and he's been taking a tour of the United States.
Well,
James Dealey says he can't think of another player that has been traded even 2 times. This guy's been on the move 3 times so far.
I mean, look, it's a big country. You got to get to know
That's
it.
true.
There's a lot of places to see, a lot of national parks, and he's seeing them all.
It's true. All right. Well, the reason why I want to bring all those up, again, you can kind of see it here. Rugby Atlanta or this future LA team, all of their trades essentially just acquiring 2024 salary cap consideration. Mumson, Basson, Hilu, Haskin, all for money, all for 2024 cap considerations that we don't know the value of. And you may raise a question in your head on what the heck this actually is, what the heck the value of this is. And it's James Dealey mentioned it was a steal, and you'd probably agree the same, Matt, for getting Mumson and Basson. But I think there's an ideology here, and this is completely conjecture. This is completely me pulling stuff out of thin air and having no reliable sources in this at all and knowing how
Do
this is
not.
all operating. But it is clear that this LA team, this future LA team to be named, wants to start fresh. And they maybe have a vision and something in place that they want to just start from a baseline, have the money available, have the opportunity to go get players they want. They are beginning a new franchise in a city that is highly attractive to attract international guys, to attract players to come play in that city. I get it. Mumson, Basson, great players and guys that you can build around of. But maybe there's just a start fresh idea here and they want to make LA their own team rather than building off of something that was built in Rugby Atlanta that has worked in the past. I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
the right decision. I'm not saying that that's the way that this team should operate, but it seems like that's the direction that they want to go. That they're just offloading the guys, trying to get value for it, whatever that value may be, which obviously we're very unclear about. But then go ahead and be able to start this LA team from anew and build from the ground up.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of feels like it's happened before in LA where a team has gone and signed a bunch of marquee players
It's true.
and then ended up still exceeding the cap and then the team folding. So let's see how this goes. I'm not sure what's going to happen here. Yeah, it's LA. Yeah, they can pull some big time players, but where are they? Like, then what's happening? Something they can, like, players are signing with teams as we go. The Premiership just started, right? We're looking at all these leagues are starting to start. Super Rugby is going to start making their signings now that the NPC Bunnings Cup has their grand final this weekend. You know, what's going to happen here? I think it'll be interesting to see. LA, to me, hasn't shown any signs of being anywhere close to putting together a roster or even having any type of structure or organization. So to me, I just think that they're clearing house for the fact that people don't want to, these players don't want to be part of an organization that there's unclarity,
could be it too.
Uncertainty with, as well as, you know, LA's great, but you look at the cost of living there. Some guys are just facing reality and saying, Atlanta was nowhere near that.
We're taking the economics course now.
Economics course. You know, I got to bring the business side. Somebody has to, but they might be looking at it and just going like, look, I can't afford that. I don't want to be paying that. Like, ship me off to somewhere else. In Atlanta or LA is just trying to get what they can from this. And that's just,
and I mean, again, a lot of this is conjecture. A lot of this is just speculation and just trying to just put the pieces together and what we're trying to expect.
And we suck at that, by the way.
But I think what is clear is that there has been a lack of clarity in terms of this LA team, and we're still trying to figure out kind of how that's operating. The three other trades, again, not so much fantasy relevant, but Joeli Tukoisuva is traded to Dallas for Danny Christensen with San Diego.
Before we move on to this one actually, not the players as part of this, but when you look at the San Diego halfback room, you look at Jason Higgins and Richard Judd, this tells me that something's happening in that halfback room. I don't know who's moving, but Richard Judd wasn't part of those big signing lists. You would expect Richard Judd to be kind of a big priority for them because of how important he was to that team. Jason Higgins, I don't see him going anywhere unless I've missed something. But yeah, to me, I think this kind of says something about the halfback room. Small thing, but something to look forward to.
Definitely. And then Connor Burns going to Miami from Utah for 2024 salary cap consideration. Again, Connor Burns, not a guy that was really fantasy relevant. And then James Fifale going to San Diego for 2024 cap considerations from the Dallas Jackals cap considerations. San Diego gets James Fifale.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing for those two for me is that I think this is good for Miami filling out those U.S. eligible or North American eligible. I believe Connor Burns is North American eligible. So they got to fill out those spots somehow. Obviously, they're trying to do this while making some big international signings, like we said before. So kind of good to see there. And San Diego also continuing to bolster their roster, add some depth.
And it is funny. You go down the list of the trades that happened over the course of the past few weeks. 5 of the 6 of them, all for 2024 cap considerations, which is pretty to say the least. But hey, again, still trying to figure out this whole MLR draft value. You know, in Madden, when you make those trades and you have that value that goes up in the bar and you try to make it equal so that it goes through.
These ones make no sense. It feels like I just traded a 7th for Tom Brady. Okay, like this something's not adding up here, Rye.
that bar is still to be discovered here for the inevitable. Hey, when that was it that Rugby 24 comes out or whatever. I don't know when it comes to if you create a franchise for Major League Rugby. I don't know how that's going to be figured out in terms of how to operate any of these
Yeah.
trades. But nonetheless, I I I concede. We'll see more of these trades kind of fall through here more in the offseason. Maybe we'll get it figured out. But hey, more than halfway through, I'm not sure I have any better understanding of it, but we'll get through it. Especially that Mumson and Basson trade that kind of completely throws it off. But yeah, those are the signings and the trades that happened over the course of a few weeks. Oh, can take a little bit of a breath here. Just a lot
Jeez.
to catch up on. A whole bunch of movement that's having an effect on fantasy rugby. I think the big thing here is that there's kind of those explicit moves where you look at some of these re-signings, you're like, hey, these guys are going to be impactful guys. You look at everything that San Diego did. You looked at what Fa'anana Schultz did, the excitement around Dave Kearney coming to the Chicago Hounds.
Yeah.
But there's also those between the lines moves that you can kind of look deeper in and talk about how, Danny Christensen going to San Diego, kind of you can read something from that. That's just the fantasy brain churning, and that's
Well,
what it
yeah.
costs to get a fantasy MLR championship here. The Fantasy Ruckers League champion, your name on the back of this jersey here,
And
on the
Ryan,
Fantasy Ruckers jersey.
notably, couple teams very quiet. Couple
That's true.
Northeastern teams very quiet.
Very true.
You look at that Rugby New York Ironworkers Bridge Builder team, very quiet. You look at that New England Free Jack team, very quiet. So it'll be interesting. I'm sure we'll hear more from them later on.
It'll be interesting. And just want to wrap up the show with just some outside news that is kind of
Yeah, I'm gonna throw one
outside
at
the
the
realm
end
of the
too, Ryan.
signings. So a few retirees. Cole Zarconi retiring from Seattle. Two bigger ones. Dylan Smith. He's been a
Oof.
staple name with the MLR with Houston, playing
Yeah.
at that 9 position, playing at that wing position. He was a marquee name that at the early stages of this fantasy thing that people had in their lineups. And then the big one here, Calvin Whiting. Obviously a leader when it comes to that Utah team. Vandy
Sorry,
obviously
Vandy.
loved him on his squad there, or excuse me, as being part of his Utah Warriors team. A guy that was fantasy relevant, 124.1 fantasy points. Had his explosive games there, a high of 18.6 in round 16. Calvin Whiting will be next, hanging up the boots. A few guys with marquee MLR names there that are calling it an end to their career.
Yeah. Way to go, guys. Way to have a great career. That's all I got for you there on those retirees.
And then kind of the next steps, we never often see this. We kind of hear about these retirees and then they move on. But hey, cool to see Will Hooley, who retired after this past season, getting a role with the MLR as technical director,
I
job
think I
to grow
know.
the Rugby Network and grow rugby in America and help the MLR.
I think I know who Marcel Brocky's source is. Right? I
Yeah,
think
no,
we found
yeah.
it. I think we found,
No
they
kidding.
didn't just happen to play on San Diego Legion together. They didn't just happen to represent their country together. And now he's saying that he's got sources from that there's a green light. That sounds right up the technical director's alley. So
Yeah,
Will
fair
Hooley,
enough.
if you know what's right, maybe don't listen to your old buddy Marcel because you're not going to help grow the game that way. But yeah, I think there's one more news, Ryan, that you got.
Yeah, one more that I got, then I'll leave it to you, Matt, for your last bit before we close out the show. Cool to see Chicago Hounds are returning to SeatGeek Stadium, obviously the host of the 2023 final. It's been one of the crowd favorites when it comes to stadiums across Major League Rugby. It's always cool to see that, that we're maintaining at least growth here in Major League Rugby. And it's cool to see these teams kind of stick with especially a place like SeatGeek Stadium, which was, again, I only heard glowing reviews when it came to watching matches there in Chicago.
Yeah, and it definitely made for a good broadcast as well. So no complaints there. Happy to see them back in their in that stadium. But yeah, Ryan, I got, we talk a little bit about the NPC Bunnies Cup, and I just got to round it out with something just because we didn't have enough New England Free Jacks news today. I just had to round it out. Manawatu Turbos, they finished like third last because of all the MLR players that they had on their squad. But it is what it is.
They were looking good for a bit there.
Well, third last, Ryan, third last or second last, maybe. Anyways, Bodine Waka named Player of the Year for the Manawatu Turbos. Good for him. I mean, it's good to see that even though he didn't get that much time with the New England Free Jacks at the end of the year and in the playoffs, he still got that form, performing in one of the best provincial, I would say, kind of leagues in the world. And yeah, I think it's great to see that he's still in form and he's going to come back to the New England Free Jacks kind of on that momentum, and we're going to see a great year coming out of him, at least in my opinion. So somebody's going to draft him early, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, let me say that there has been no shortage of positive news, I should say, for the Major League Rugby in terms of seeing some of these players grow, seeing all these signings and trades and international players coming in.
Yeah.
There, it just feels like there's been a whole bunch more movement within the league.
Yep.
That just shows that, you know, it's an operating league and it's growing and it's something that it's cool to see. I haven't
Yep.
seen this busy of an off season in the history of
For
Major
sure.
League Rugby thus far, and it's just cool to talk about it. Cool how it relates to fantasy rugby. Cool how it relates to fantasy MLR. Yeah, it's just an exciting time here for Major
And the
League Rugby.
crazy thing, Ryan, is that silly season continues.
Silly season
There is no
continues.
end. We remember last year how late some of these signings happened.
Yep.
We remember last year that, you know, couple of big timings when the Super Rugby teams are announced, we see some of those guys coming over here. So yeah, there's some big still I think we're gonna have some big weeks like this, or some big few weeks like this. And I'm excited. I'm looking forward to what this means to the MLR. I'm looking forward to breaking down all of these signings from the MLR. And I'm even looking forward to trying to analyze these players so that when it comes draft time, we're ready. We know who's who. We're valuing these players correctly, unlike we did last year. And we're going to have a lot better rankings upcoming year than we do as we round these rankings up in the next episode.
Absolutely. You'll want to be listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show here to get all those latest news and notes and how it pertains and relates to fantasy MLR, because again, there's no shortage of impact that it's going to have for this upcoming 2024 season. Stay in the know. We're still working hard to bring it to the masses, so you'll want to be following us everywhere at the Fantasy Ruckers to be first in the know when it comes to that. And hey, enjoy this exciting time for rugby. The MLR might not be on right now. Obviously, we're counting down the days for that to happen, but Rugby World Cup, the semifinals are coming this weekend. Enjoy those. The finals is going to be a great one. And of course, there's just going to be a whole bunch of more off-season stuff here when it comes to Major League Rugby that we'll want to break down. And hey, our top fantasy player reveal from the 2023 season continues next episode. So we'll be breaking down centers. You want to tune in for the next episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show for that continuation of the best centers. Pretty fantasy relevant, and what that means for the upcoming season.
Yep. And I mean, leading into next week, up the All Blacks. I hope to make to the final, and I'm still wearing this jersey next week.
And rest in peace, Ireland, and to all my friends who were supporting, so confident for the Ireland to bring home a little bit of hardware this year. Maybe in another 4 years, we'll see.
Maybe.
All right, for Matt Yee, for myself, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, we'll be back next week here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
Miss you, Vandy.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.